In the summer of 1889, an American woman stood in a Liverpool courtroom and listened as a judge sentenced her to die. The evidence against her was thin. The judge presiding over her trial would, within 2 years, be declared insane and confined to an asylum. She would never see her children again. She would spend 15 years in an English prison for a crime that, according to the British Home Secretary himself, may not have even been a crime at all. Her name was Florence Maybrick, and her case would become one of the most disputed convictions in Victorian legal history. This is the story of a woman who was tried, not for what she did, but for who she was. Before she became a name in legal textbooks, Florence Elizabeth Chandler was a child of the American South. She was born on the 3rd of September, 1862, in Mobile, Alabama. Her father, William Chandler, had once served as mayor of the city and was a partner in a respected banking firm. He died before she was born. Florence grew up in privilege, but also in instability. Her mother remarried twice, eventually marrying a German cavalry officer named Baron Adolf von Roques. The family moved between America and Europe, and by the time Florence was 17 years old, she was crossing the Atlantic on a steamship bound for England. It was on that ship, in 1880, that she met James Maybrick. He was a cotton merchant from Liverpool. He was 40 years old. She was 17. Other passengers on the ship were reportedly shocked by how much time the teenage American girl spent alone in the company of a man more than twice her age. But the courtship continued after they reached land, and on the 27th of July, 1881, Florence Chandler became Florence Maybrick. The wedding took place at St. James's Church in Piccadilly, London. The couple settled in a grand house called Battlecrease, in Aigburth, a suburb of Liverpool. On the surface, they were the picture of Victorian success. They attended the most important balls. They appeared at the most fashionable functions. Florence, young and American and beautiful, made an immediate impression on Liverpool society. But behind the doors of Battlecrease House, the marriage was already breaking apart. James Maybrick was, by every available account, a hypochondriac. He was obsessed with his own health, and he had a habit that, even in the 19th century, struck those around him as dangerous. He took arsenic. In Victorian England, arsenic was widely available. It was sold in flypapers. It was used in patent medicines. Some men of that era believed, despite all medical evidence, that small doses of arsenic acted as an aphrodisiac, a tonic, a stimulant. James Maybrick was one of those men. He purchased arsenic regularly from a Liverpool chemist over a period of years. He also took strychnine. A search of Battlecrease House would later reveal that James Maybrick had stockpiled enough poison to kill at least 50 people. This is a fact that would prove crucial. And it is a fact that, according to many later analysts, the jury at Florence's trial did not properly understand. James Maybrick was also unfaithful. He kept a long-standing mistress who bore him 5 children. Florence, who learned of this betrayal during her marriage, eventually began a relationship of her own with a Liverpool businessman named Alfred Brierley. In the spring of 1889, James discovered the affair. There was a violent confrontation. According to reports, he assaulted Florence and declared his intention to seek a divorce. By all accounts, the wish was mutual. What happened next would become the foundation of the case against her. On the 27th of April, 1889, James Maybrick fell seriously ill. His doctors treated him for acute dyspepsia, a kind of severe digestive distress. But his condition continued to worsen. On the 8th of May, Florence wrote a letter to Alfred Brierley. The letter was intercepted by the family nanny, a woman named Alice Yap. According to the historical record, Yap held a deep personal dislike for Florence. She did not deliver the letter. Instead, she passed it to James Maybrick's brother, Edwin, who was staying at the house. Edwin shared the letter with another brother, Michael Maybrick, who effectively controlled the family. Michael, like Yap, reportedly disliked Florence intensely. Within hours, Florence was removed as mistress of her own home. She was placed under what the family called house arrest, confined to her room while her husband lay dying downstairs. On the 9th of May, a nurse reported that Florence had tampered with a bottle of Valentine's meat juice, a popular Victorian invalid food. The bottle was later found to contain a small quantity of arsenic. Florence's explanation was straightforward. She testified that her husband had asked her to add the arsenic himself, as a pick-me-up. He was, after all, a man who took arsenic regularly. He never drank from the bottle. On the 11th of May, 1889, James Maybrick died at home in Aigburth. His brothers, already suspicious, demanded a post-mortem examination. The body was found to contain traces of arsenic, but the amount was small. The post-mortem report concluded that the quantity present was not, on its own, enough to be considered fatal. It remains officially uncertain to this day whether that arsenic was administered by another person, or whether it was simply the residue of James Maybrick's own long-standing habit of self-dosing. Florence Maybrick was arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. Her trial began at St. George's Hall in Liverpool, before a judge named Mr. Justice James Fitzjames Stephen. This judge would later become central to the controversy surrounding the case. At the time of the trial, Justice Stephen was considered one of the most distinguished legal minds in England. But according to multiple later analyses, including a scholarly paper published by the University of the West of Scotland, his mental state during the Maybrick trial was already deteriorating. Within 2 years of presiding over Florence Maybrick's case, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen would be removed from the bench. He would be confined to an asylum in Ipswich. He would be officially declared insane. But in the summer of 1889, he was the man holding Florence Maybrick's life in his hands. The trial quickly became something other than a murder trial. According to legal historians, the prosecution's evidence on the actual cause of death was weak. The amount of arsenic in James Maybrick's body was small. His own consumption of arsenic over years was well documented. The forensic science of the 19th century could not reliably distinguish between arsenic administered by Florence and arsenic that James had taken himself. So the trial shifted focus. It became, in the words of one academic paper, a morality trial. The prosecution emphasized Florence's affair with Alfred Brierly. The judge, in his summing up, dwelt at length on her adultery, on her American background, on her perceived character. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Florence Maybrick was found guilty. She was sentenced to death by hanging. The reaction was immediate and international. Newspapers in both Britain and the United States published articles describing the trial as a miscarriage of justice. Crowds gathered in support of Florence. Petitions were organized. A petition for her clemency, signed by prominent Americans, including the Vice President of the United States, Levi P. Morton, was eventually delivered to the British government. The Home Secretary at the time was a man named Henry Matthews. Together with the Lord Chancellor, Lord Halsbury, he reviewed Florence Maybrick's case. What they concluded would become one of the most extraordinary statements in British legal history. They wrote, and this is taken directly from the historical record, that the evidence clearly established that Mrs. Maybrick had administered poison to her husband with intent to murder. But, they added, there was ground for reasonable doubt as to whether that arsenic was actually the cause of his death. In other words, the British government decided she had attempted murder, but could not be certain she had succeeded. Attempted murder, in 1889, was not a capital offence. It would not have justified the death sentence. But rather than overturn the conviction, the Home Secretary chose a different path. He commuted Florence Maybrick's death sentence to life imprisonment. She would serve that sentence for a crime she had never been charged with, never tried for, and never legally convicted of. She was 26 years old. Florence was first transported to Woking District Female Convict Prison. She spent her first 9 months in solitary confinement. She was subjected to what was known as the silent system, a regime in which prisoners were forbidden to speak at any time. In her memoir, published years later under the title My 15 Lost Years, Florence would describe solitary confinement as the most cruel feature of English penal servitude. She wrote of the desolation, the despair, the hopeless monotony. She suffered insomnia. She fell ill repeatedly. She described being kept awake at night by the shrieking of mentally ill inmates in surrounding cells. In 1896, she was transferred to Aylesbury Prison. There, she was assigned hard labor. Her days began at 6 in the morning and ended at 5:30 in the evening. She washed dishes. She scrubbed tables. She cleaned floors. She prepared meals for hundreds of other prisoners. Throughout these years, her supporters never stopped fighting. New evidence was publicized. Petitions were renewed. Even Lord Russell of Killowen, the Lord Chief Justice of England himself, advocated for her release. The Home Office refused. Finally, on the 25th of January, 1904, after more than 14 years in custody, Florence Maybrick was released from Aylesbury Prison. She was 41 years old. She had lost her youth, her marriage, her reputation, and her children. She would never see her son or her daughter again. The story does not end there. And in fact, it takes a turn that, more than a century later, continues to divide historians. In 1992, a document surfaced that claimed to be the personal diary of Jack the Ripper. The diary identified the Ripper as James Maybrick, Florence's husband. The authenticity of the diary remains heavily disputed. Many experts consider it a modern forgery. Others, including investigative journalists and historians, have argued that elements of the document align with known facts about the Maybrick family in ways that are difficult to explain. This much is fact. James Maybrick was a Liverpool businessman who travelled regularly to London during the autumn of 1888. He had a documented history of arsenic use, of mental instability, and of violent rage toward his wife. In 2015, the filmmaker and writer Bruce Robinson published a book titled They All Love Jack, Busting the Ripper. After 15 years of research, Robinson advanced a different theory. He argued that the Ripper was not James Maybrick himself, but rather James's brother, Michael Maybrick. The same Michael who had ordered Florence placed under house arrest. The same Michael who had hated her. Robinson's theory remains disputed, but it raises an unsettling possibility that Florence Maybrick was not only wrongfully convicted of murder, but may have been the deliberate target of a campaign by a brother-in-law with secrets of his own to protect. This remains a contested area of historical research. Independent scholars disagree. The official position is that James Maybrick is one of many suspects in the Ripper case, and that no definitive evidence has ever conclusively identified the killer. What is not disputed is what happened to Florence. After her release in 1904, she returned to the United States. She reclaimed her maiden name, Florence Elizabeth Chandler. She published her memoir. She gave lectures on prison reform. But the world had moved on without her. The fashionable young American woman of 1880 had become a 50-year-old recluse. She eventually settled in a 3-room bungalow in Gaylordsville, Connecticut. She kept cats. She rarely spoke to neighbors. The few residents who eventually discovered her true identity reportedly chose to keep her secret. On the 23rd of October, 1941, Florence Maybrick was found dead in her home. She was 79 years old. She had been living alone. She had been penniless. Her obituary appeared the next day at the top of page 1 of the New York Times. Among her few possessions, neighbors found a scrapbook of newspaper clippings from her former life and a tattered family Bible. She was buried, at her own request, beside a friend named Clara Dulin, in a quiet cemetery in South Kent, Connecticut. Her son, the boy she had been forbidden to see, had become a mining engineer. He died in 1911 of accidental poisoning, after mistaking a cyanide solution for a glass of water. The case of Florence Maybrick was never reopened. There has been no posthumous pardon. There has been no official acknowledgement that her conviction was unsafe. The British state has never formally said it was wrong. And yet the questions that surrounded her trial in 1889 remain unanswered today. Was James Maybrick poisoned by his wife, or did he die from the long-term effects of his own habitual self-dosing? Was Florence the victim of a deliberate campaign by her in-laws, who had reason to want her removed? Was the judge, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, already mentally unfit to preside over a capital trial in the summer he sent her to the gallows? And how do we reconcile a legal system that admitted, in writing, that it could not be sure she had caused her husband's death, but kept her imprisoned for 15 years anyway? These are not questions that can be answered by the courts of 1941, or 2004, or 2026. The witnesses are dead. The evidence is lost. The truth, whatever it was, went into the ground with James Maybrick in 1889. But Florence's story remains. It remains as a record of what happens when a court decides to try a woman, not for the act she may have committed, but for the life she had lived. A young American woman, a bad marriage, a love affair, and a Victorian courtroom that could not separate the question of guilt from the question of morality. Florence Maybrick spent 15 years in prison. She died alone with her cats, in a country that had long since forgotten her name. Her case remains, more than a century later, one of the most cited examples of why criminal courts of appeal exist in the United Kingdom today. Her trial, more